Good evening to all. It is a pleasure and a huge honor for me to have the opportunity once again to be on the anniversary of La Bosa, and it is very interesting what a demo was. Talking about the truth is that I had two possible dissertations, one on the reform that we are going to be doing in the organic charter of the central bank and the reforms associated with it, which has to do with the shutdown, which has to do with the reform of the capital market, which has to do with the beginning of the transformation of the insurance market, basically, the other part or the other dissertation that was planned or that was going to be given was on economic growth, and Adamos and words have made me cheese. I was discussing it with the head of the cabinet, and he clearly said what he preferred me to talk about, and Adamo chose that topic, so we are going to talk about economic growth. The first thing we have to understand is the role of the capital market, that is, to understand where we are standing, and it is neither more nor less than understanding a balance sheet. On the left side of the balance sheet is, let's say, countably the asset, what economists usually call capital, which in the end is neither more nor less than the accumulated flow of investment, and on the other side of finances it is wealth, which is neither more nor less than the accumulation of savings, and which could be a third or of its own, and there is a difference between if it is debt or equity in that sense. That is the balance sheet of stocks, and the key to growth has to do with what it does to increase productivity, and what it does to increase the productivity per capita, which is what is going to be manifested in higher salaries, in better living standards, in less indigenous, in less poor children, depend on the accumulation of capital, and to accumulate capital we have to invest, that is, let's say, convert the balance sheet or stocks into flows, that is, in terms of variations, and that investment has to be financed. And that financing comes from savings. In that sense, where an institution like the stock market, let's say, and that is complementary, let's say, to banks and the entire structure of them, financial system is to channel savings towards investment, and that requires, first of all, a deep respect for the right to property. If we violate the right to property, there are no incentives to save, which historically in Argentina the different governments have been dedicated to stealing from Argentines to violate the right to property, but at the same time it also has to finance the investment, and let's say the one who invests has to be able to capture the results of the investment, with which the right to property also plays a fundamental role, and that is why it is not redundant that we are sending a law to Congress to declare inviolability. and respect and defense of the right to property, because respecting the right to property is what is going to allow us to save, invest, grow, and become powerful again. It is also interesting, like other laws, as a principle of revelation, because it is clear that those who oppose the firm defense of the right to property, as we postulate based on the liberal order, it is clear that those are the enemies of progress. See them speak. See them act. Those are the responsible for the Argentine decline. Those are the ones who violated the right to property. Those are the ones that sank us. In that sense, the right to property is also important as a basic mechanism for the operation of the price system. One of the most wonderful things in the Socialism book by Ludwig von Mises, when he demonstrated the impossibility of socialism, was that socialism was not possible, basically because it could not be in the economic calculation, and the economic calculation has to do with the determination of prices, and it is impossible to determine prices without private property. Because I tell him I can sell alcohol, these microphones, but how much I give does not matter to me, because these microphones are not mine, and it is more so if the money that he had to spend, let's say, not outside of him, imagine the disaster that would be, because that nobody would have what he would be spending. There would be no economic calculation, there would be no prices, and if you do not have prices, you do not have a mechanism of coordination in the economy. You do not know who are going to be the ones who buy and who are the ones who sell. That is, there will be no supply and demand, and therefore there will also be no mechanism of adjustment in the face of those imbalances, and consequently those economies will fail, and that is what happened with socialism. Therefore, let's say what is happening in Congress is of vital importance for Argentina to be big again, and that, let's say, what is at this moment I'm describing as what would be the right side of the balance sheet. The counterpart is the left side of the balance sheet. It is what happens on the real side. So let's say what is going to make the capital stock of this economy, what is going to generate the investment, and the opposite of that is growth. That is why the financial framework is so important, that it allows to channel savings into investment. From here, the importance of financial institutions, and in particular the stock market, of the capital market. Having said this, then now I am going to enter into the discussion of economic growth. Actually, I'm going to make a first theoretical digression to know what we talk about when we talk about growth. Basically, I am going to explain this, the economists call the hockey stick. That those of us who have dedicated ourselves to economic growth is the most important thing for us, obviously. Then I am going to offer an interpretation that I think is the correct one on how to look at this process, let's say based on a model of Odegela. And then I am going to be presenting the results of the work we did with Dr. Damien Riedel. Let's say, I don't know, while I give it an oral version, there will be no plagiarism, because they are not going to call plagiarism to the addition, let's say, to use a corrector of text. So let's say I don't know, except that later they acted with artificial intelligence. What I am saying, beyond, let's say, the humiliation and the stupidity of mediocre economists and ignorant journalists, once I finish to raise that conceptual framework, I'm going to raise the story with the design of policies that we carry out and give the foundations of why Argentina will be great again, I say, for those of us who have decided to specialize in economic growth, that is, in my other life and when I was a serious economist, and now I work on something else. Basically, the most shocking thing is to see what is called the hockey stick, which is the PPI per capita series. I say that it was done by an economist called Angus Madison, who created a field called Millenary Macroeconomics and basically shares a PPI per capita throughout the history of humanity since the Christian era, and shows that the PPI per capita until the year 1800 was practically constant. It only had a small jump in the 15th century and 16. Taking that out, basically the growth rate of the PPI per capita was 0.2%. That is, 3,500 years were needed to be able to double the PPI per capita. However, after the year 1800, the population of the world multiplied by 10 and the PPI per capita did it for more than 15 times. That is to say that the PPI rose 150 times. That is to say that the increase in the population had as a result a much more than proportional growth of production. That in economics is called growing performance. The idea is that then when you are in front of that series is how to explain it in the period where the PPI was practically flat is usually recognized as the Malthusian era, and the problem is that those model families did not have a connection, the attempts of Solow and Swan. Truly, the model threw interesting results in terms of convergence. That is to say that those countries that were in the middle of the Malthusian era, in terms of convergence, that is to say that those countries that were younger could grow faster to reach the big countries, or the developed countries, as you want to say. But I also had another problem, is that in the stationary state the economy did not grow. And what we see throughout what was the 19th century and the 20th century is that the world economy was continuously accelerating growth. In the 19th century, it jumped to 0.66 per capita. In the first part of the 20th century, it did it at 1.6. In the second, it did it above. The two, let's say, if you look at what is happening in the 21st century, it is around 3. Therefore, a model that in the stationary state does not grow is not seen to be a good hypothesis. In fact, it is not. Then I say the economists began to work on this endogenous growth when Robert Solow tried to test. His model gave a terrible result. He could only explain 15% from there. He tried to explain the residue of Solow, and the reality is that there were two. Analytical alternatives. One, let's say, was to put technological progress in, and exogenous state. Therefore, it was a finger, but hey, it was Samuelson's finger, which was no less. But taking the jerk out, and then there was the Chicago hypothesis based on human capital. But the way in which literature was inclined by the exogenous technological progress made that the field was losing relevance towards the end of the 70s until an economist appeared. Actually, a mathematician who decided to study economics, Paul Romer, and designed and created the theory of endogenous growth in one of the models that he made. We say that basically it is a basis of his doctoral thesis. We say he incorporated human capital, and we say later was raised by Robert Lucas, and then all the rebirth of the theory of growth began based on these models of endogenous growth. In fact, last year they also received the Nobel Prize in Economics. 3 economists linked to endogenous growth. Half of the Nobel Prize was taken to him and Hewitt for applying the Schumpeterian hypothesis of creative destruction, and the other part was taken to Mocher, who poses, let's say, the challenges of biotechnology, let's say, to generate economic growth, and let's say against all the pessimists of secular stagnation. However, let's say the models of endogenous growth and the models of endogenous growth are still the same. They were up to a time 2 bikes that worked differently, and it was as if he had to have a model that changed hands from one side to the other. In that context, an economist appeared who was called Oded Gayler, and who generated the unified theory of economic growth based on an empirical work of Menkir, David Rama, and David Whale, where they basically test empirically and show that 70 points of economic growth are derived from human capital. Then to explain the 15, it goes to explain the 85 and 70 points explains human capital. What the model of Oded Gayler does is generate a model with a trigger, because let's say in the middle of the 15th century, let's say, with the appearance of the printer allows to accumulate growth, and there is a level of population collapse in millions of people, and from there economic growth is triggered by scale effects and goes from the Malthusian trap to, let's say, the period of endogenous growth, which is the part that rises on the hockey stick. I mentioned it because one of the legs of our strategy of economic growth is based on the Ministry of Human Capital. That is to say, where for the first time in the history of Argentina social assistance stopped being to give people fish to teach them to fish, and that, let's say, Damal is fully aware of what is being done in the paternal building with the Ministry of Human Capital, where the minister herself points out that while before they asked for social plans, now they're asking for work. On the other hand, any model, let's say, that presents growing yields is faced with a problem.
Por otra parte, cualquier modelo, digamos, que presente rendimientos crecientes se enfrenta a un problema.
And it is if I have growing yields and expand the amount of an increase of product, grows more than proportionally, and I find a problem where the trees could grow to the sky, then that raises a serious conceptual problem. That is why, let's say, the traditional models
Por eso, digamos, los modelos tradicionales
Of endogenous growth based on growing yields usually have patches so that the model does not explode.
suelen tener parches para que el modelo no explote.
For the case of Dr. Riedel and for me, that was not a comfortable solution.
Para el caso del Dr. Riedel y para mí, eso no era una solución.
Then, as we did not like, we decided to build a new analytical framework.
Como no nos gustaba, decidimos construir un marco analítico nuevo, novedoso.
That did not have a result, that had to be patched because look at putting mathematical solutions to models. Let's say it is interesting from mathematics, allows them to get the problem. But when you have to make decisions, and behind there is the life of 47 million human beings, let's say making those methodological jumps is a little more risky. Consequently, we started to work in a different analytical framework. The underlying idea is very simple. And it is in general, let's say all here who have studied economics, if they did a good microeconomics course, they will have come to study general equilibrium, and when they study general equilibrium, the first model they study is the Robinson-Crusoe model, the Robinson-Crusoe model. If you take it seriously, it is quite ridiculous because it seems to me that Robinson was a tremendous bipolar. That is to say, to be able to use the separation theorem and be able to have a price vector. I say God is a schizophrenic, God is bipolar, the boy, because one day, let's say in a moment, you have to put the consumer's cap, and at another moment you have to put the producer's cap. And then there to determine how in reality, let's say, it is easier, it is a simpler problem. But it is misplaced in the economic theory, and that was what we liked, and we started to reformulate. The reality is that you companies or someone's papers that you can be commercializing. Behind the owners of those people, there is someone who owns those papers that decided to save and not suddenly consume. Therefore, what you have to understand is the decision-making process. And the decision-making process also implies that people are owners of companies. And just as they have companies, they also consume. Then when you consider this, what happens? You in the measure that they are consuming more, each additional consumer unit reports a low level of satisfaction. Technically, it is called marginal utility of increasing to see how much they would pay for a glass of water. In the middle of the desert of the prefer of light of the day in a lot for the second, they would pay much less. For the third, much less after taking 50 liters if they bring him a glass of water. They throw it in the head. Okay, that is to say the marginal utility of increasing you the satisfaction that arise from each additional consumer unit is less and less. Now generate an additional consumer unit. I say someone has to produce it, and if someone has to produce it, no matter how much you have, growing performance demands more and more work time, and more work time demands that they will have less and less partners, and if you have less and less partners, the level of he did not give them the same salary by saying in some way winning 100, then winning 500,000. Well then, or at the same salary, they did not give you the same to work more or less. Well, it means that as you work more time, the leisure is made more and more valuable. Then, in the measure that you are consuming more, they derive less and less satisfaction.
cada vez menor satisfacción.
And as they are putting more work, they have fewer partners, and each time that
Más trabajo, tienen menos socios, y cada vez la desutilidad
after
de eso
increases,
aumenta.
well, there comes a
Bueno,
time when
llega
they
un
know that
momento
it
que
is
saben
tied
que
up.
se empata.
Therefore, the
Por lo
first thing
tanto,
I
lo
am
primero
going to
que le
tell
voy
you,
a
and that is
decir,
one of
que
the
es una de las
contributions that the paper has,
contribuciones que tiene el
is
paper,
that the model has
es
an
que el
interior
modelo
solution. That is to say, the trees do not grow to the sky.
tiene una solución interior, es decir, los árboles no crecen hasta el cielo.
God, that is not a minor
Pero
point, because
eso
it
no es
means
un
that what
punto
we are
piloto,
thinking has
quiere
at
decir que
least
lo que estamos pensando tiene, por lo
has
menos, tiene
acidity in the
asidero
real
en el mundo
world.
real. Ahora,
Now that is not there,
eso
because that
no
is to
queda
show
ahí,
that you
porque
can have
eso
a
es para
solution
mostrar que
with
ustedes pueden tener una solución
varying
con
performance that is interior, that does not exploit, but now we have to explain
pero ahora tenemos que
growth. What
explicar el
happens when I
crecimiento.
now say I want to grow?
¿Qué
Let's
pasa
say I
cuando
will be
yo
able to
ahorro y yo
accumulate
quiero crecer? Digamos, yo voy a poder
capital, and I will be able to accumulate work. Well, when you make that extension now, the model
Bueno, cuando ustedes hacen esa extensión, ahora el
happens to
modelo
have
pasa a
multiple
tener
balances, and
equilibrios
specifically
múltiples.
they will find that the model has
Y concretamente se van a encontrar que el
three
modelo
balances.
tiene
It is a balance
tres
of trap of
equilibrios.
poverty, it has a balance of prosperity,
Tiene un equilibrio de trampa de pobreza, tiene un equilibrio de
whose two
prosperidad,
balances are stable, and it has an
esos
intermediate
dos
that is
equilibrios
unstable.
son
This means
estables, y tiene uno intermedio que es inestable.
that you,
Esto
according
quiere
to what the
decir que
parameters
ustedes,
are, or become prosperous or become
según
pro.
cuáles sean los parámetros, o se vuelven prósperos o se vuelven pobres.
Now, does it
Ahora,
depend on that you become
depende de
poor
que
or become
ustedes se
prosperous?
vuelvan pobres o se vuelvan prósperos.
And that
Y eso
depends on the amount
depende
of
de la
capital that is.
cantidad
And like the previous
de
convergence
capital.
models,
Es decir, a diferencia de los modelos anteriores de
with the scale
convergencia,
did not matter, now the
donde no
scale does
importaba
matter.
la
It is
escala,
the size
ahora
now
sí
does matter.
importa la escala. Es decir, el tamaño ahora sí
That is,
importa.
it is not that you say they are going to converge in
Es
any
decir, no es
way.
que ustedes,
No, they
digamos,
need a
van a
minimum
converger de
scale.
cualquier manera. No. Necesitan una escala
If they do
mínima.
not think, and the
Si no,
important thing is what are the elements that determine that minimum
lo
scale.
importante es cuáles son los elementos que determinan esa escala mínima.
That is, for you to reach
Es
that
decir,
minimum
para
scale,
ustedes
you have to
llegar
then
a
have
esa
a
escala
minimum
mínima,
capital stock.
tienen que entonces tener un stock de capital
And to have
mínimo.
a minimum capital stock, you
Y
need to
para tener
generate
un
income and
stock de
save.
capital mínimo, necesitan antes, ¿qué cosa? Generar ingresos y ahorrar.
Therefore, if you have a society
Por
that
lo
spills the
tanto, si
money, that
ustedes
does
tienen
not
una
save,
sociedad que despilfarra el dinero, que no ahorra,
no matter how much you
por
generate
más que
income, you
generen
will not be able
ingresos,
to
no
grow if
van
you
a
ever
poder
discussed any
crecer.
populist
Si
government
ustedes tienen un gobierno asquerosamente
that generates
populista
15
que
points of
genera
deficit in
15
terms of
puntos de déficit
GDP, they are
fiscal en
going to
términos de
crash.
PBI, se van a estrellar.
No, not now, before we
Ahora
left that
no, antes
precisely.
nosotros salimos de eso.
That is,
justamente.
we made that adjustment that the damn
Es decir,
populists
nosotros
left the bomb
hicimos
planted.
ese ajuste que los malditos populistas dejaron plantado la
Yes,
bomba.
let's say I'm going to finish this mandate and I'm going to be re-elected and I'm going to have 4
Digamos,
more
voy a
years.
terminar, digamos, este mandato y voy a ser reelecto y voy a tener 4 años más.
I'm
Voy a
going to
meter
put
y te voy
And
a
I'm
dar una
going to
mala
give you some
noticia
bad news.
adicional.
We are setting the
Estamos
basis for
sentando las
100
bases
years
para
of
100 años de
liberalism.
liberalismo. Por lo
Therefore,
tanto,
if
si
you
no te
don't like
gusta,
it,
andate a
go to Cuba. Therefore, a first mechanism to generate prosperity was to close the fiscal deficit.
Por lo tanto, un primer mecanismo para generar prosperidad fue cerrar el déficit fiscal.
To recover
para
the savings and
recuperar
recover the
el ahorro y
financing to the
recuperar
investment.
el financiamiento a la inversión.
Recovering the right to
Recuperar
property is
derechos de
fundamental
propiedad
to
es
precisely return to
fundamental
generate interaction
para
between savings and
justamente
investment.
volver a generar interacción entre ahorro e inversión.
But even so, I
Pero
have to
aún
generate
así,
income, and to generate
tengo
income,
que
I need to
generar
work.
ingresos. Y para generar ingresos, necesito trabajar.
Therefore, those
Por lo
populists who
tanto,
promote the culture of
aquellos
anti-work are also
populistas
sinking us.
que impulsan la cultura del antitrabajo también nos están
Those who
hundiendo.
promote vacation,
Aquellos
those
que
who promote punishing the one who works
la
and benefiting the
vagancia,
lazy,
aquellos que promueven castigar al que trabaja y beneficiar al
those are
vago,
the ones who
esos
made
son los que
Argentina sink
hicieron
during the
que
last
Argentina se
100
estuviera
years.
hundiendo durante los últimos 100 años.
Therefore, saving is important, investment is important, the culture of work is important.
Por lo tanto, es importante el ahorro, es importante la inversión, es importante la cultura del trabajo.
So as not to fall into the balance that leads us to poverty, so as not to violate that minimum scale,
Conduce a la pobreza, para no violentar esa escala mínima.
but not only that, because that makes us not go to the balance of trap of poverty,
Porque eso hace que no vayamos al equilibrio de trampa de pobreza.
and what is going to take us to the other balance, that we can earn money, that we have the incentive to invest. That is to say that we respect the right to property, and the right to property as it is in the May Pact has to do with two sides. One is the size of public spending, because the size of public spending implies taxes.
El tamaño del gasto público, porque el tamaño del gasto público implica impuestos.
Therefore, it is fundamental not only to generate savings.
No solo generar el ahorro.
It is not the same to reach the fiscal balance by putting an adjustment. The balance of the treasury that we had 5 points of deficit of the PBI, not only that we did it by lowering the expense, but we lowered the expense so much that for the first time in history a government returns to the Argentines 3 points of the PBI. That is, we returned 8 points from the treasury and 10 points from the central bank. And the important thing is that it is not only the question of respect for the right to property, of not being routed by taxes. There is another form of robbery, that is by regulation. If you, for example, had a building where offices are rented, and an idiot comes to you and puts the rent control law, what is going to happen? What is going to happen? Of course, the first you know, while the contracts are there, it does not happen. But then what happens? The offer is withdrawn, the price of the rent increases, the quality of the departments and offices deteriorates. Then they end up paying more expensive and fewer amounts. And as you have regulated, you have an excess of demand. And supposedly they wanted to protect the most vulnerable. They only get housing to those who are in condition to pay more, with which they also ruin the lives of the most vulnerable. That is why the Ministry of Regulation is so important. This ministry has reached 16,500 deregulations in the last few days. Look at how we took the state's beat off. Therefore, respecting the right to property in deregulating, giving freedom back to individuals, allows them to reach a higher level of equilibrium. Therefore, let's say the model solves the issue of growing performance in a legitimate way. Not only that, but it also shows the trap to poverty. It shows how harmful populism is to punish savings, to punish work, to put regulations and blow their heads off. Because what that does is run the minimum scale and increases the chances that you get into the trap of poverty. And if they manage to get to the level they can aspire to, it is low. Not only that, the first contribution that the article has, and this is purely and exclusively thanks to Demian, who is a physicist, is to have incorporated the Bellman barriers for the first time in a work, and a tool with which it is possible to solve this model. What does this mean? That each of the things we do for tax equilibrium, in the cultural battle and in human capital, fostering labor culture, fostering labor, fostering savings, deregulating, lowering taxes, our economic growth strategy. Therefore, now what I'm going to do is to enter and discuss why Argentina is going to be great again. Basically, so that you invest. The companies that invest because the state is created by the businessmen. The state does not create them, the parasite does not create them, the entrepreneurs like he create them, not the parasites of the state. And to create value, I could say that the key value drivers, in general terms, because if I put myself in particular, it is endless. In general terms, it has to do with the existence of the flow of funds. And there is a role of taxes, there is a role of the interest rate, and there is a role of the growth rate. Flow of funds, for there to be a flow of funds, there has to be business. Clearly, as we were removing the weight of the state, the Argentines of good, new business opportunities began to appear. And in that sense today, not only our engine of growth is the fields, from agriculture, from livestock, but also we find new engines of growth. Everything linked to gas and oil. And do not come to tell me that it was the result of having nationalized IPF, because the action of IPF at that time cost $3 and today it costs 15 times more. Not only that, but also we have mining, we have what has to do with copper. Think about the case of Chile, exports $60,000 million. We export only 5,000 and we are 70% of the mountain range. Something we have done wrong, and it is that for almost 100 years, we have lived shitting ourselves systematically about private property. But what can we expect from people who have never done a fucking business in their lives? They do not want to respect them, of course. Obviously, the parasite lives to expropriate. But having said that, why don't you rent a living room and go to talk if you want to talk so much? In the time when I was not president, I gave conferences for 1,000, 2,000, and I have even put up to 10,000 people. You have a career if you like to talk so much. Cuckoo. Not only that, it also means that we export $5,000 million. Look at everything. We have to multiply our copper production, our lithium production. Everything that has to do with rare minerals. Not only that, everything that has to do with uranium and nuclear energy. We are in conditions to generate small or intermediate nuclear reactors, which puts us again at the forefront of technological progress and nuclear matter. Also everything that is flourishing the economy of knowledge. The possibility of having cheap energy with cold weather to develop artificial intelligence. Come on, if we are not great again, it is because we do not want and we are not stupid.
y o somos unos boludos.
The other issue is the
El otro
tax.
tema es el de los impuestos.
As I pointed out, never in the history of Argentina have we seen that a government
Nunca en la historia de la Argentina ustedes vieron que un gobierno
has lowered or
haya
eliminated
bajado o
about 20
eliminado
taxes
cerca de 20 impuestos
and has returned to
y
the
le haya
Argentines
devuelto a
3
los
points of the
argentinos
PBI,
de bien 3 puntos del
but we are
PBI.
not going to stay there.
Pero no nos vamos a quedar
As the
ahí.
economy
En la
continues to
medida
grow,
que
we
la
will continue
economía
to lower
siga
taxes.
creciendo, vamos a seguir bajando los impuestos.
And not only that,
Y no solo
if we
eso,
achieve the re-election and continue to transit a path of growth that we are kindly taking,
si logramos la reelección y seguimos
we will be
transitando
retaining
ese
to the
tema
Argentines from here in
estamos
2031 $500,000 million in low taxes.
devolviendo a los argentinos de acá al 2031 500
The other point
millones
is the
de
interest
dólares en
rate.
baja de impuestos.
The interest rate that is an intertemporal coordination mechanism.
El otro
Basically,
punto
one
es
of the
la tasa
components
de
that you can
interés.
find is the country's risk.
La tasa de interés, que es un mecanismo de coordinación
When we get to power, the
intertemporal,
country's risk is the country's risk.
básicamente, uno de los componentes que ustedes pueden encontrar
The other
es
point
en
is the
nuestro
country's
país.
risk. When we get to power, the country's risk was around 3,000 basic points.
Estaba en torno a los 3.000 puntos básicos.
And thanks to the extraordinary work done by the Minister of Economy, Toto Capito, the best Minister of Economy in the history of Argentina, today the country's risk is around 400 basic points. In addition, inflation continues to drop.
Además, sigue bajando la inflación.
Therefore, not only will the dollar rate continue
No
to
solo va a
drop,
seguir bajando la tasa en
but
dólares,
also the peso rate will continue to
también va a
drop.
seguir bajando la tasa en pesos.
And as we are not going to negotiate the fiscal balance in any way,
De ninguna manera el equilibrio fiscal,
the debt-product
relación
relationship will continue to
deuda-producto va a
fall,
seguir cayendo,
the country's
va a
risk will
seguir
continue
cayendo
to
en
fall,
nuestro país, y
and
tarde o
sooner or
temprano
later
nos
we
vamos a
will become an
convertir en
investment grade. Finally, we have the growth rate.
Tenemos la tasa de crecimiento.
And in terms of growth rate,
Tasa de crecimiento
the engines that we have on and the whole machine are three.
tenemos encendidos y a toda máquina son tres.
A first engine of growth is human capital.
De crecimiento es el capital humano.
As I said, we changed the logic of social policy.
Política social.
We stopped giving them fish to teach them how to fish.
Para enseñarles a pescar.
We have integrated in the same Ministry of Children and Families,
Niñez y familia,
obviously because of the nature of health problems.
naturaleza de los problemas en salud.
It is a ministry,
Es un ministerio.
but it is integrated in children and families' health education.
Educación.
See how interesting it is, because
Porque
if you do not measure, you do not know what the problems are.
saben de qué se tratan los problemas.
And we start with the test to learn.
Empezamos a aprender.
One of the things that had happened to us during the Kizarism
Serismo,
is that they threw us out of the PISA test,
PISA.
and they threw us out for having seized the sample.
La muestra.
That is, we have bad results,
Teníamos resultados malos.
but still having seized the sample where it could have been better.
Habiendo sesgado la muestra a donde podía dar mejor.
This is interesting because if you enlarge the sample,
Ustedes amplían la muestra,
the results you have to get are worse
los resultados que tienen que conseguir son peores.
because they had a sample problem.
De muestra.
And it is also very difficult to improve a point per year,
Un punto por año,
because
porque
basically, for
básicamente
example, if they are going to evaluate in sixth grade,
van a evaluar en sexto grado.
they are already 5 years behind.
Entonces,
Then it is like they have a lot of inertia, they have a loss of weight.
eso,
However, despite having enlarged the
a pesar
sample,
de haber ampliado la muestra,
the performance in mathematics was the same,
quedaron
with which it is relatively an improvement.
es una mejora porque
We enlarged the sample and it did not fall, but also 10 points were raised in language evaluations.
en las evaluaciones de lengua.
Look, we are improving the quality of our human capital.
de nuestro capital humano.
Not only that, we are also improving human capital,
También estamos mejorando el capital humano porque
because one, we sincered the economy of 57% of the pro. We went to 29%. The indigenous people went from 20% to 6%.
a
and the profits of 70% went to 42%. Is there any chance? Yes, obviously, there is a lot missing. Don't you think I will reverse 100 years of decline in 2.5 years? Of course there is a lot left, but we are on the right track. And not only that, once you finish your education, you have to enter the labor market. Why didn't you enter? Why didn't our young people get a job? Because the system was hyper-regulated. So, of course, no one could leave. Consequently, no one entered. And that's why we found ourselves, when we reached more than 50% of the economy, in the informal segment. And I also remind you, policy speakers, if we had inherited Switzerland, I tell you that 30% of the formal jobs were below the poverty line. That is to say, in Argentina, Cuba, not even being a formal work was enough to get out of poverty. Therefore, we are working on reinserting those who fell out of the system and those who finish up close to enter. But that could not be achieved without a more agile, more flexible labor law, more in line with the times that run, and against all those who are in poverty, and against all the forecasts, and with respect to the failure, not only of all the governments, of the return of democracy, not even the military coup, and had the balls to make a labor modernization, like the one that we did, after having won the intermediate elections. Therefore, we are also moving forward, so that those individuals who enter the labor market can have a place, and those who have fallen out of the system can be reinstated. And that is what will allow us, is to have a place in the labor market. And that is what will allow us, is a greater number of people to enter the labor markets, and with greater qualifications, to be more productive. The second engine of growth is basically the Ministry of Regulation. That is the Ministry of Increasing Returns. Is every day throwing 17 regulations to the shit. 16,500 in 2.5 years. The machine of generating freedom, the machine of prosperity, from the Ministry of Regulation. And finally we have, and this was already in Adam Smith. Adam Smith, he spoke of the Ophilis factory, which was neither more nor less than describing the increasing returns, said that the division of labor, the increasing returns, are limited by the size of the market. Therefore, if you open the economy, the size of the market expands, and therefore they can grow more. Today, Argentina has an opening coefficient of less than 30%, when due to its income size, it should have an opening coefficient of more than 90%. Therefore, we are starting the path of making the Argentine economy increasingly free, increasingly open. If we sign the agreement of the European Union, market after 25 years, that it was stuck, and that they went to the meetings, let's say, to say nice little speeches and not solve anything. It was enough that there was someone who wanted to push the opening agenda so that this would work. Not only that, we are also in agreement with the United States, where we are advancing and we are perfecting it day by day. Let's say there is the CNEFTA agreement, there is the Trans-Pacific Agreement, that is, we are working so that Argentina, let's say, is an economy more open, more competitive, and that allows us to grow more. In short, there are business opportunities for Argentina to grow. Also, it seems that the seat of general bonds, they're very big. Now let's say the mediocrity of economists, they go with that from here. Some who grow a lot, others who grow little. It seems that they never in their life study the growth process. What do you think? That everything grows proportionally. I rarely say that saying, spend you studying models with a single agent of a single business. It seems that they were stupid. And some parts, let's say, they forgot to look at them. And in that sense, it is like technological progress. Technological progress is not neutral. Let's say the day Edison invented the lamp, it is clear that a sector of the lamp expanded. Look how well it does not go. And well, the candle sector was postponed. Now it is also true. Now it is also true that that does not happen from one day to the next. It is not instantaneous. The problem is that when you put regulations to punish the lamps, and of course the candle maker stays looking at the ceiling, and instead of trying to compete or to convert, he goes and asks a corrupt politician that protects him. Well, look, the jerk of the protected parasites is over. Now they're going to have to compete. But time has come to compete. First point. First, because trade is more efficient. If I have a good that in the market is worth 100, and a corrupt businessman agrees with corrupt politicians to be able to charge 400. If you, let's say, they have a company, they take care of 920 jobs, but if they want to touch the privilege, they serve the workers on the street the day that the labor modernization law is going to be treated to generate a crisis. That's it. Said this. Not that, but another of the same. When you know clearly that inefficient breed with the consumer now, let's say that good, instead of paying 400, pays 100. Now it has 300 in hand. That is going to spend it in other economic good, and that's what is going to generate jobs of better quality in other sectors of the economy that people do want. Clear, loses the corrupt businessman, the corrupt politician, let's say, but they win. 47 million Argentine and the 920 workers will have to go to work in another sector. That is why it is so important, a flexible labor market. And it is also important not to be slowing down technological progress, because if not, when they do, the technological catch-up in the middle, if it is going to leave a transition, then, and the other thing to understand is that you have to lose fear of technological progress. If the little ones were right, those who are afraid of technological progress, they were right, and that they destroy jobs, and no more jobs are created. Given that all this process of virtuous growth started back in 1800, and given that the population multiplied by 10, today the unemployment rate should be 90%, and yet there is no happen. Therefore, all that little lobby has to do with a group of corrupts who do not want to compete. who want to keep having pre-sales that also ended in Argentina. Therefore, we have all the conditions to grow. We have all the conditions to be great again. The only thing we need is to be reborn, our entrepreneurial spirit. If we do that, we are going to make Argentina great. We are going to be great again. May God bless you all. May the force of heaven be with you. And long life freedom.